Hello. Good morning, everybody. Great to see so many fresh faces on a Monday morning. My name's Cecile Sullivan-Elder and I'm the Executive Officer of Family Advocacy. We're hosting the event today. We actually had Nathan Moran, who was here. He was the CEO of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council that was coming to do the ceremony for Welcome to Country. He's actually sick this morning, so I'll be actually doing it on his behalf. So Family Advocacy acknowledges the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of our land, Australia. Family Advocacy also acknowledges the Gadigal of the Eora Nations as traditional custodians of this place we call Sydney. Okay, so today we're brought together to have a conversation about what a fully inclusive education system looks like. All significant change takes a clear vision, courage, and a collective forward motion. So it's really heartening to see so many families, educators and politicians here today that are genuinely interested in what our education system should look like when all children, regardless of difference, are educated together. Before we start the day, we're going to do a quick exercise. I'd like you to turn to somebody, whether it's in front of you or beside you, introduce yourself, ask them where you're from and why you're here today. Now this exercise is only going to take a minute or so off you go. Okay, thanks for that and great to hear so much conversation in the room. I hope you gain some insights into who's in the room and why we're here. Okay, so where does Australia stand in the inclusive education space and where are we heading? As stated earlier, all great change takes a clear vision and currently this is lacking in Australia. Before we delve into these questions today, we want to be clear on the reality that exists for many children with disability. The reality is that many children continue to be segregated into different learning environments from their peers, and this is regardless of the strong evidence that supports full inclusion. It's also regardless of the significant moral dilemma that segregation of any group presents. Late last week I was out walking and I was greeted by some very enthusiastic young children who were leaving a primary school after an orientation day for kindergarten. One little girl was very excited and she started skipping alongside me, telling me all about her day and the great promise she held for the following year in starting kindergarten. I couldn't help but be excited for her. But as I left the group, I couldn't also help ponder what must go through the mind and the heart of a little person with disability if they were to start their education journey in a special school or any kind of separate setting that kept them apart from all their peers. Would they wonder why they had to attend a school or a class that was separate from their brothers and sisters, separate from the other kids in the neighbourhood? Would they question their value as a person because of this? Would they question the value of how other people saw them? And as I continued along this path, as they continued along this path through their school years, would the difference they felt be strengthened until they saw themselves as outsiders, as not the same as the other kids? And would this then impact on how they saw their futures and where they saw themselves belonging in society? My thinking then turned to the other children in this who would be alien to the experience of children with disability, simply due to not sharing the same spaces, and the powerful message that this would be sending them. This made me sad, as clearly it sets up a future where people with disability continue to be seen as the other, in other places and doing other things. I would hope that this is not the case, but it doesn't take too much imagination to understand the potential impacts of segregation, as much of our history has given us this insight already. And our innate ability as humans to know when we experience a sense of belonging is very acute even at this young age. As I continued my walk, I felt the strengthening of the moral imperative we're all faced with in working towards a system that educates all children. A system that intentionally creates a sense of belonging and hopefully sets up young people to go into their futures better prepared and more accepting of how diverse we all are. Today, we want to skip past the discussion on whether we believe educating all children together is the best way forward in this country. as the question is not about our beliefs and more about our moral responsibility. So the narrative we've set for the day has a clear vision and the ability for courageous collective forward motion into a future where the possibilities of strengthening our society comes closer to reality. We have some fantastic speakers throughout the day. They will present insights into both the necessary change in creating one education system from here and around the world, and we'll also be looking at elements of implementation within the school community. All speakers throughout the day have been chosen for their exceptional leadership in this space, whether it be political leadership, educational leadership, or family leadership. Now, before I leave you to get on with the learnings of the day, I want to challenge you all in whatever role you hold to only see the potential in the possibilities today. Now I'd like to introduce the Honourable Rob Stokes, who's the New South Wales Minister for Education. Minister Stokes would formally like to open the event.
Thanks, Cecile. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. In opening, I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend those respects to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be in the room with us. I also wanted to acknowledge, frankly, all of you, because this is about inclusivity, so in one sense it seems slightly inappropriate to single out people for particular acknowledgement. Nevertheless, it is appropriate that I do acknowledge some of our international guests, in particular Jody Carr, who is a Canadian political leader and has already at his young age developed an impressive political legacy in relation to his work in championing inclusive education in the Canadian province of New Brunswick. I also wanted to acknowledge my parliamentary colleague Adhd, who is the Shadow Minister for Education, who will be speaking later, and also Emma Hussar, who is the federal member for Lindsay in outer metropolitan Sydney. But most importantly, I wanted to acknowledge all of you, all of the delegates here today, whether you are educators, academics, or most importantly, parents. Thank you for your passion and for your commitment to the future of young people, and to your and therefore to your commitment to the future of this great country, because we know that education is the great enabler, and the stronger and fairer and more just our education system, the stronger and fairer and more just our society. In opening today's event, I looked for inspiration from some of my political mentors and heroes of the past. And I was reading some weeks ago a memoir of Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt, during the depths of the Great Depression, which was a crisis that demonstrated the cruelty of unrestrained capitalism and highlighted the cleavages between the haves and the have-nots. And he was desperate to bring together a fractured nation and use the new medium of the time of radio to speak to the collective community and articulate a vision for how to rebuild this troubled nation. And he said that his vision was to create an inclusive society, to build a country where no one was left out. And that spirit of inclusivity has permeated all of political thought really ever since. And one sense it's intrinsic to what building a body politic is all about. Whether we're talking about public transportation, whether we're talking about healthcare, or as I've mentioned, education being the great enabler, surely inclusivity is at the heart of education. This was recently re-emphasised in the Sustainable Development Goals, a series of goals for collective international action on the things that matter to humanity working together. Number 4 of those goals was to build an education system that was equitable, that was inclusive, and that was lifelong. Now, clearly, in relation to each of those goals, there is still work to do, and they are goals that will constantly face new challenges, but they are estimable goals and wonderful goals to work together. And I thank you so much for coming together. And as Cecile opened with, it's one thing to have the vision, it's another thing to do the work, to come up with concrete proposals to advocate for real change. And that's what today is all about. Wolfgang Goethe once said that by all means have your castles in the sky, but then go about creating foundations underneath them. I had the wonderful opportunity over the weekend to attend a community paddling event in my community on the Pittwater. Beautiful day for it. And this event was a race around Scotland Island. And it was an event in support of a local charity that does some great work with disabled children, or children with a disability. And this group has worked in my community for many, many years and has a lot of support. But what I really observed about the event was there were different categories of entrants participating in the race. There were elite athletes. There were people with a whole range of different craft. And there were a lot of young people with a disability who were also participating in the race. Everyone was participating together. Everyone was included in this particular event. There was recognition of the different capacity of different people in terms of the elite athletes all the way through to people like me who really didn't know what I was doing. But we all felt included, we all felt involved, we all felt known, and we all felt special as a part of this event. And so I suppose in one way that provides a metaphor of what inclusivity in every part of our society should all be about, which is about valuing everyone, which is about acknowledging there is difference in society and there will always be difference in society, but creating pathways to ensure that everyone is included, that everyone is valued, and that everyone is treated with equality and with respect. Thank you so much for inviting me along to open this conference, and I wish you all the very best with your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Stokes, and really promising to hear of what you think is possible. Okay, so now without further ado, I'd like to introduce our MC for the day, Gina Wilson-Burns. Gina comes very well qualified as a long-standing member of family advocacy and until about 8 hours ago a committee member and past chair. Gina is also very much involved in the education space, personally supporting her son Mac attend his local high school and on a systems level working towards systems change. So she's one of those exceptional leaders that we mentioned earlier. So round of applause for Gina for today.
Thanks, Cecile. Welcome everybody to this very exciting day. I actually have goosebumps when I look out to the sea of people that have come together to focus our attention on inclusive education and to consider the roadmap ahead. As Cecile mentioned, I've been involved in family advocacy for the best part of a decade now. First as a somewhat unassuming workshop attendee, developing into a fledgling advocate, and more recently in governance roles within the organisation. Through the advocacy, leadership and development, training and insights and opportunities provided by family advocacy, my husband Sean and I have seen our son Mac enjoy a very ordinary but inclusive life right from preschool through primary at his local school. Despite a label by the Department of Education as the most disabled child ever to be mainstreamed, and notwithstanding some early teething problems, Mac did, as a result of his school's willingness to learn, change and evolve, enjoy both academic and social successes. And his primary school was recognised last year as an exemplar under the education standards by the federal government. High school and transition brought a new round of teething problems. However, through changes in leadership and the chipping away at historic barriers, we're all looking forward to the opportunities ahead as Mac enters Year 9. Oh, and just as an aside, the Department of Ed don't actually have a league table of most disabled student within the department. As we've become acutely aware, people are more often than not disabled by the environment and the settings they find themselves in and not their diagnoses. So as I pop my MC hat on for today, I should cover off some of our housekeeping items. Firstly, if I can have the staff from Family Advocacy stand up. These are the people you should seek out should you have any queries. You'll notice they're all wearing red lanyards to make themselves easy to find. If coincidentally you happen to wear your favourite red lanyard today, you might find yourself a little bit busier in breaks than you anticipated. To find the bathrooms, including accessible bathrooms, as you head out the back of the ballroom, head around to the left. In the event we need to use the emergency exits, follow the green running man signs. I'd suggest you don't follow his modelling and just walk briskly, not run. And they're located front and back of the ballroom and out in the foyer, clearly marked. We have a day packed with presentations and speakers. We have 3 break times scheduled. When you're in the foyer in the break times and you hear the bells and gongs chiming to signal the start of the next session, please head back in. We'll be starting right on time and you won't want to miss a moment. We've tried to pick bells that won't set the politicians off and make them think they have to go and vote. So hopefully that won't cause moments of anxiety. Mobile phones should all be switched to silent. We'd love to see you join the conversation throughout the day using Facebook and Twitter and using the hashtags that you can see up on the screen and dotted around the room. In the foyer, you'll notice an extensive resource table. Please have a look during the breaks, but don't forget to nourish yourselves during those breaks. We'll make sure the list of resources are available after the event. You may have spotted a photo booth as you were coming in the foyer. Do find a moment to pick up an inclusion statement sign that resonates and ensure you have your photo taken so that we can share those images. And finally, my last housekeeping item. I actually don't have this much housekeeping at home, so I'm out of practice. But as you might be aware, and this one's really important, there's an advocacy campaign underway at the moment. Our current state government has decided to cease all advocacy funding as of July next year. This will obviously be devastating to the many marginalised groups in New South Wales, not in the least people with disabilities and families. So do visit Alex or Leslie at the table out in the foyer next to the photo booth, get more information and show your support to this really important advocacy campaign. But now on to the main event. This first session will focus our attention on the overarching concepts of inclusive education. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Australia's Disability Discrimination Commissioner, Alastair McEwin. Alistair comes into this space as someone who has extensive personal and professional experience of disability and is passionate about his role as National Advocate for all people with disability. Please welcome Alistair.
Hello and good morning everyone. I too also want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of, or rather on top of the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respect to their elders past and present, and I also want to pay my respect to Aboriginal people who are present here today. I'm so pleased to be here because education is absolutely fundamental. I would argue that housing and education are the absolute fundamentals of our society. If we are to have a truly inclusive society, then we need accessible education or inclusive education and accessible housing. I also want to acknowledge, as Minister Stokes said, everyone in the room, individually and collectively, you play the most incredibly important role. I can't do my job without the work that you do, the research, the advocacy, the campaigning, the story, the collective wisdom, all that feeds into the work that I do, which I then hope that I can amplify to government and to the community in general. I also want to acknowledge there are so many familiar faces here, and without wanting to exclude anyone in particular, I acknowledge members of Parliament who are here, and in particular our international Member of Parliament who I had the pleasure of meeting last night. So Jodie Carr, welcome, and I hope that you are enjoying your time in Australia, and I believe there's Vegemite waiting for you out there, Vegemite and toast. And I also have a very strong relationship or connection with Canada. I spent 2 years at the University of British Columbia, and what an eye-opener that was for accessible, inclusive education. Having come from an environment of the University of Adelaide, Stanstone University, Group of 8, quite conservative in its approach then, I must stress, before the Disability Discrimination Act came into operation, I had a lot of struggle. It was so refreshing going from Adelaide University to the University of British Columbia, where it wasn't I had to advocate, it was what do you need? What will make your learning experience accessible? And so I came back from Canada in my mid-20s feeling invigorated, motivated and inspired to see what we can achieve here in Australia. And so since the DDA in 1992, although I should clarify, in March next year we are celebrating the 25th anniversary. The DDA itself was passed by Commonwealth Government in 1992 but came into effect on the 1st of March 1993. So next March, or this coming March, we are celebrating 25 years. So it's an opportunity to reflect, think about how far have we come and how much more do we need to do. And for me, I think we have come a long way, but we have got so much more to do. In some areas of life, we have seen some improvement, we have seen some win, we have seen some inclusion. And I reflect on these things. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which came into, well, was adopted by the UN in United Nations in 2006, so we've passed the 10th anniversary. We are coming up to the 10th anniversary of when Australia ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, when they said we will commit to incorporating the CRPD into domestic law. So that's coming up on the 10th anniversary. So you can see some milestones. And then, of course, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS, the 4 letters that I hear every day. So many people have so much hope, and I think it's important to remember that. Of course there will be teething problems, of course there will be implementation problems, and at times they are overwhelming when I reflect on all that we need to do. That said, I commend the government for its commitment to it, despite, as we often sometimes see, Labor and Liberals, oh, well, you didn't fund it properly, well, you rushed into it, oh, but you're still not funding. We need to always remember it will achieve win for everybody, and it frustrates me when people talk about the potential downfall of the NDIS. Now, if I was to advocate or merely suggest to the community that we remove Medicare, or that we remove Centrelink, or that we remove Veterans Affairs support, you can imagine the outrage, you can imagine the outcry. Medicare is not perfect, it's far from perfect, but it's something that has become so part of the Australian society, we take it for granted. So in 25 years from now, I want to see a society where the NDIS is merely one part of how we live life. And of course, this brings us to why we're here today, inclusive education. And for me, I have to say, I had an inclusive education, primary and secondary. I don't think I'd be standing here as a commissioner if I hadn't had that support. And I also grew up thinking it was part of life to have teachers of the deaf with me, one-on-one tutoring in the classroom if I needed it, or to be taken out of the classroom from time to time for extra support, to be included in the school camp, to be included in the school activity, to just think, why would I think it was any different? And then, what a cold, hard shock at the age of 17 to go to Adelaide University and completely opposite. The complete contrast of me having to then advocate. And at the age of 17, I was not the advocate that I am today, and I think that's fair to say for anyone who hadn't been given that opportunity to be confident. So that's why the NDIS and inclusive education are critical to making sure anyone can be independent and confident. I have to also commend the work that Family Advocacy New South Wales does and all the other advocacy organisations do and the representative organisation, and I am gravely concerned about the impending or the proposed funding cuts. My challenge to you, and I know you are doing it well, is to keep talking about it. when I was at Community Legal Centres New South Wales up until last year, we were also facing funding cuts. And the thing that struck me the most was when you get everyone talking about it, when you get people realising if you take it away, what does it really mean? So I commend you for the work that you're doing, and I'm supporting you in that, and I will do what I can to make sure that we don't remove something at a time when we actually need it more than ever. People with disabilities themselves need to be able to say the NDIS and advocacy is important to me, and at a time of massive change with the NDIS implementation, it is critical that individual and systemic advocacy remain as a core function of how we interact with the community and with the government. I commend also with Children with Disability Australia, who have defined inclusive education well, in my view, to say that it involved embracing human diversity and welcoming all children and adults as equal members of an educational community. And this involves valuing and supporting the full participation of all people together within mainstream educational setting. And as Minister Stokes pointed out, it's about just seeing it as part of the community. So the example he gave of going to a community event and seeing people with disabilities or children with disability. If we are invisible to government, to policy makers, then the challenge is even greater. Until people can conceptualise what it means to be excluded, we need to make sure that inclusive means being visible. And because I love my international convention, I also want to, I know you would know all this, the Convention on the Rights of the Child also makes it clear that every child has a right to educational opportunity that encourages the development of their personality, talent, and mental and physical ability. Every single child has potential. Just like every single child is naughty from time to time, or every single child maybe don't want to be a pilot when they're at the age of 8, they want to be a pilot, but as they get older. A person who's blind can be a pilot if we just need to put the right support in. A person who is deaf can be a DJ with music if. So that's the approach we need. They can, if. So that's Article 29 of the Rights of the Child. And of course, you know, in the CRPD, it's Article 24, which was one of the first times ever at United Nations level that recognised specifically the barriers that are in place for the child with a disability to be fully included in the classroom. It is not the person who is disabled, it is the barriers put in place by society. And the other thing for me is, when we talk about international conventions and international law, I know that that is often a difficult and abstract concept, particularly for our members of parliament. And I think for us, it's important to talk about the story, to talk about the barriers, but also to reflect on guidelines that are often produced by the UN. And for here, and for today in particular, we have what's known as General Comment 4, produced by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a comprehensive, detailed outline of all the things that have stopped children with disabilities being included in mainstream society or mainstream schooling. Things like ableism, everyday ableism. And the common ones are, oh, well, the child is deaf, or the child is blind, they won't be able to go on the school camp, or they can't go to the canteen, or just let them eat their lunch on their own in the classroom. Everyday ableism. So the challenge for all of us is to think about the small thing that actually then develop into full-scale exclusion. So the UN General Comment 4 is a very detailed, very well thought out guide, and it talks about inclusive education. It talks about the stigma and the invisibility that result from segregated education. And you have to remember, every single child is a future employer, is a future provider of support to the community. So if they have not interacted or been hanging out with kids with disabilities in school, it makes it even more harder for them when they become the employers or the workers or the staff of organisation, for them to know how easy it is to include people with disabilities in everyday life. The other thing for me also, in terms of an international point of view, is we need to also learn from others around the world. And so I've had the privilege and honour of meeting people from around the world in my many years of advocacy. And I'm still struck by meeting someone from Thailand who worked in education, who would tell me, and this was 2007, so only a mere 10 years ago, of if a child in her village or her area in Thailand was born with an obvious physical disability, they might be taken away to a forest and never seen again. So you have to remember there are still societies out there that devalue a child with disability. So for me, it's imperative that we learn from our colleagues around the world. We inspire them, but equally we need to be inspired by others. And I want to commend in particular Jody Carr for his brilliant work in New Brunswick in challenging long-held views of, well, you know what, the child is actually happier in a special school, but that's not for us to measure, that's not for us to judge. The child has rights. The child has a right like anyone else. So thank you, Jody, for your wonderful work. Now coming back to Australia. What have I been doing since I started 15, 16 months ago? I thought it was important when I started to go around the country and meet with as many people as I could, because there had not been a full-time Disability Discrimination Commissioner for a number of years. And when I met with everyone, or as many as I could, a recurring theme came up: education. Children and their parents and their families and their friends and support workers told me of their frustration from even not even being able to enrol in the local school, from literally meeting or facing the metaphorical brick wall, an absolute refusal to even consider the possibilities of a child with disability being in the classroom. I also heard about how other parents, and I know this is familiar to many of you, would say, I don't want my child being with a child with disability. So that's probably our biggest challenge, is to change the attitude and the community view of people with disability. In other words, it's not my issue, it's not my problem, and I don't want my child hanging out with that kid. And that's hurtful. And if I've got many stories that I can tell you, and the thing that I remember the most is how hurtful it was. And so we need to always remember teachers play an incredibly important role, and principals do. So that's what I heard a lot, and I also continue to hear that. At the Australian Human Rights Commission, where I'm based, 2 doors away from here, though I probably had the shortest commute to today's conference, we have a complaint handling process. I'm independent of the individual complaint. However, I keep an eye on the trends and the numbers and the common themes coming through. And education last year, or last financial year, was the 3rd highest number of complaints in disability discrimination, around about 11%. The 2 highest, hovering around the 30%, 20-30% mark, were goods and services, or access to goods and services, and employment. And education was number 3. I should also mention that of all the complaints that we receive at the Commission, for the last 5 years, disability discrimination has been the highest, at around about 38 to 40% of the total number of complaints. So clearly, a lot needs to be done. And a lot of the things that we see in the education complaints are a breakdown in communication or relationship between the school and the parent and the family. And I want to make sure that, for me, it's critical to support the teachers and principals to be more aware of the Disability Discrimination Act educational standard, which is also something that many people told me is it's almost worthless. It's almost not worth the paper it's written on. When you compare progress in Australia under the DDA, the three standards that we have are access to premises, accessible transport, and education. And I think it's fair to say we've seen some positive progress in access to premises. So new buildings are being built with access in mind, mostly. We see the growing number of accessible buses and trains. Still have a long way to go. But when we come to education, it's a completely different conversation. So you can see the challenge. So I've been doing a number of things in the last year, and I will going forward, is reviewing the many, many inquiries that we've had. Please, no more inquiries. I understand that it's important to research current practice, that it's important to see what the current situation is, but we've had so many inquiries at federal and state and territory levels into education, and there are a couple more ongoing, including the federal one into access to education in remote and rural areas. And we, of course, also have the Gonski review. And last year, the federal government released the inquiry into education for kids with disabilities. And the main finding there was, or the main recommendation was, a comprehensive national strategy. But it also heard about something that has also been consistent in state and territory inquiry, the use of restrictive practices. Stories of kids being locked away in school classrooms, cages, being outside in winter, excluded from their classmates, and the list goes on. And that is something that we are hearing about every week and nearly every day. Myself and the National Children's Commissioner, Megan Mitchell, have been looking at this very closely, and we have started to try and make some inroads into that with government, and you'll be hearing more about that into 2018. I think it is absolutely fundamental to address this as a priority because it's devaluing. It's about devaluing the child with a disability, and until we change that aspect, a lot of other things won't change. And it hurts me when I think about reflecting on my own experiences of being included. Of course, there was the usual young kids, making funny comments about deaf kids, and I'm still known as the deaf kid, and that's okay, but I was included and I was visible. But if you are locked away in a classroom or in a room on your own all day and your parents or guardians or family members don't know about it, then that is a shocking indictment on the way that we value and treat children with disabilities. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, which I think is coming to an end. In closing, I do want to say I'm heartened when I hear of people in Parliament talk about their own experiences with their own children with disability. But I am also incredibly disappointed and saddened when I hear about comments made from our members of Parliament, federal and state and territory, that those kids should not be in the classroom. Those kids are causing destruction to the other kids, and they're making life harder for the teacher. So we always need to rise to those challenging comments and to ensure that it's about valuing every single child. So I also want to leave you with one of my biggest role models or inspiration is Helen Keller, who, as many of you know, was deaf and blind. And she was the first deaf-blind person to graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree. And she wrote, or said, or signed, "One can never consent to creep when one feels an impulse to soar." So when I think and reflect on the work that you've been doing and all the inquiries that we've had and all the conversations we're having, and when I also reflect on how the discourse, the level of conversation is getting bigger. Some of it has been driven by the NDIS, which I'm pleased to see, but the NDIS is just one part of the bigger picture, and we need to ensure that the DDA standards on education are implemented in a meaningful way, but we also need to ensure that every child with a disability can soar. Thank you very much.
So we can take some questions. Because we have got a few minutes there. So do we have any questions for Alastair? It may have been so comprehensive that... It may have been so comprehensive that... So, did everyone in the audience hear that question? No. So the question was, can Alistair explain the difference when he got to university? From Adelaide. What was the difference?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. So I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but by saying the years, you'll probably work it out. So I started at Adelaide Uni in 1988. And that was before the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act. So awareness of disability rights and anti-discrimination laws was quite low. So when I got there, I was studying arts because at that time you had to do 1 year of a non-law degree before you could get into law school. And I asked for note-taking support. So I went to the disability liaison officer or support officer and I said, I'm deaf, I can't follow lectures. And they said, well, we can't give you note takers, but we'll give you a tape recorder, tape the lectures, take them home, and maybe your mum could write the notes. And that was a consistent theme for the first 3 to 4 years. And in my first year, I was okay because I did, out of the 4 subjects, I did 2 languages, and I loved languages. So I would do things like go home and read German and Spanish, the 2 languages I was doing, and just work out what it's been said, and so that was, and history was also, and it was just reading. So I didn't consider myself at a disadvantage, even though now I know I was at a disadvantage. But then finally, my final year of law school, after years of trying to persist, I started meeting more deaf students around Adelaide who were at University of South Australia, and they had the most fantastic support. Ausland interpreter, note-taking. So I got the disability liaison officer or support officer come with me and advocate. And she said to the woman at Adelaide Uni, this is not right. So the other thing that motivated me was somebody from my old school was starting law school and I didn't want her to go through the same experience. Then getting to Canada. Oh, by the way, I then did 6 months of my practical legal training at the University of South Australia. Was note-taking a problem? Absolutely not. Then off to Canada I went, and they literally, as I said, they asked me, so you're deaf, what do you need? And they provided things like note-taking, captioning, including for community events. So they knew how important it was to provide that. So by the time I came back from Canada, the DDA was well and truly in operation. And then I did my MBA at the University of New South Wales about 10 years ago. By then I was very confident in my ability to advocate, but I still remember when I registered for the information night that I had to sort of let them know that I needed interpreting. There was a bit of resistance, but when I enrolled in the MBA, I went to them and I sat down and explained, and they were very good. So you can see the continuum.
I think we've got one quick question, then we have to move on.
Yeah.
Katja. Big voice.
Yeah, okay. In relation to, so you mentioned the convention, the anniversary of the convention, and also of the Disability Discrimination Act. We're sort of, 2005 was when the standards were introduced, and we've had about sort of 10 years of convention. And recent sort of figures released by the Australian government show that sort of in that period
I'll just quickly summarise, I think, is the anniversary going to be an opportunity for us to have a national discussion around the fact that stats show we're going backwards around the DDA?
Yep. Absolutely. I think it's really important, as I said earlier, I think for politicians and policymakers, education is still very much an abstract concept. That typical example of when we construct a new building, a ramp, and everyone benefits, people who are older, people with disabilities. So I think next year will be the 10th anniversary of when Australia ratified. And I think it's a critical opportunity to say, education, we have to reverse the trend that we're seeing in some parts of education, but we also need to get members of parliament, who I have to say some are doing a great job in that space, but collectively, of course, we're subject to the whims of the political wind, depending on which way it's blowing. And I think, for me, education is a pillar of society. As I said, housing and education. So I welcome more conversation. I also welcome the opportunity to see just how easy it is. I know for teachers it's a challenge. You've got 30, 35 kids, but they're all probably being distracted in different ways, and we need to stop stigmatising the child with a disability too quickly. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you. And so if we accept the premise that education is a microcosm of our societies, and our next speaker fits really competently and comfortably into the research space set aside for transforming societies, then we are well placed having Professor Roger Slee take us on a journey through what authentic inclusion is. Currently a research academic at the University of South Australia. Please join me in welcoming Professor Slee to the stage.
Comfortable and confident. I'm not sure about that. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we gathered on and paying my respects to elders past and present. And also thank you to the Minister for opening the conference, and I was delighted that he commenced his remarks by drawing our references, our reference points back to notions of democracy, because that is the heart of inclusion. It's about an education for and an education in democracy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And also thank you, Commissioner, for your remarks. And I'm particularly interested in the notion of ableism, and as the Commissioner reminded us of the ubiquity, the pervasiveness of ableism, right at the heart of what I want to say this morning is that if we're to understand ableism, special education isn't up to that task. And unfortunately, we've been led to believe that it might be. Now, I think I'm supposed to have a clicker to change slides. Here it comes. Okay. Oh, that's it. The green button. Okay. No, that's okay. It looked different earlier this morning. No, it was a different kind of machinery. So what I did when I was preparing was to take the questions that were are the organising questions for the symposium, and I think they're terrific. And for those who can't see what I've put on the screen, the first question was, where is Australia at the moment with regard to inclusive education? And for those who can't see, I was trying to get across that notion of straddling a jetty and trying to get into a boat with the other foot, and the boat moving further apart, and where are we going to end up? Well, in the water. That's a fairly hard line, and I'll put it in even harder terms later. But I do want to provide a caveat, and that is that we need to maintain our optimism, and there's good reason for optimism, as the Commissioner was telling us. There's good reason for optimism, and I can see almost 200 reasons for them, for that kind of optimism when I look from where I'm standing right now. It's the people of goodwill who come together as advocates, as educators, as families, as brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters come together in order to pursue this agenda. The other kind of remark that will take away my time, something chronic, is I was thinking as I was looking at the person so kindly signing for us. I was at a conference in Greece, and they had interpreters for those of us who were unable to speak Greek. And at that particular conference, there was a father who was the head of an advocacy organisation in Greece, and he told this story about his son. He said, every morning, my son, he goes to school and he has his bag on his back. And his bag, it's full of hopes and dreams. Every night he comes home from school and his bag, it's been emptied. His hopes and dreams are on the ground, they're in the dust. And later on, I was wanting to write about that because it was just so poignant, so poetic. And I thought there's a lesson from what the father was saying. But something else happened. There was a booth at the back of the room, and in that booth were the interpreters for those of us who couldn't speak English, and for those of us who couldn't speak Greek, and for those who spoke Greek but couldn't speak English. Are you with me? I've lost track. As the father was speaking, I heard the voice in my headphones change. And I looked up behind to where the booth was, and one of the interpreters had left the booth in tears, and the other took over. And I looked around the rest of the room and I thought, later on when I was thinking about what had happened, I thought, there's the lesson. There's the lesson. The lesson wasn't just the father. The lesson was the interpreter. Here we were, a room full of educators, all with dry eyes. Every one of us with dry eyes. We weren't shaken by the horror of the account of the father, as was the interpreter, who was a stranger to that gathering. So, in thinking about inclusive education, what is inclusive education? I take as my touch point education for all. And when I talk about all, I don't have caveats for that. I'm not saying all except for. All means all. I want to, because I'm Professor of Education, I like to give the illusion every now and then that I'm a good teacher. I know something about education. So I'm actually going to pass it over to you now for a quick activity. I want you to... Hold on. I want you to think of some major breakthroughs in the world since the years 1984. Don't worry about 1975, that's probably only me that remembers that. But 1978 or 1984. I want you just to turn to the person next to you and see what you would put on your list as major breakthroughs since that time. And because I'm a good educator, let me do some scaffolding. I think you can do a whole lot better than talking about Pisa, NAPLAN, or the George Foreman grill. Although one of those things is very, very useful. So, just talking, compiling your list amongst yourselves very quickly. Okay, I said it was an illusion that I was a good educator, so I'm not going to give you any more time than that. It is just an illusion. So, what kinds of things did you have as your major breakthroughs, world events, inventions? What kinds of things? One at a time. Mobile phone, digital technology, World Wide Web, all of that kind of stuff. Yep. Yes?
Linked into that, social media.
Social media? That's wonderful. Yes? A man after my own heart. Yes, indeed. What else? Sorry? Yes, yes, indeed. I remember the last book I wrote, I took a day off at the inauguration of Obama and to listen, and I remember weeping. And then writing the next book, I took a day off for the inauguration of the new president and wept as well. Yeah. What else? Sorry, I'm taking much too long on this.
End of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, end of Cold War and Berlin Wall. Slow down. Some people might talk about the Irish settlement. Yes. Yes.
Access to communication, for example, sign language interpreters.
Yep. New technologies to increase access. So there's a whole lot that we can talk about there. Why did I choose the years 1978 and 1984, 1975 behind it? So 1978 was the Warnock Report. I'm assuming that you've got copies of the Warnock Report on your bedside table and were leafing through it last night. Her Majesty's inquiry into education for handicapped children, as the language was at that time in the UK. And Mary Warnock was the principal author of that report. And the report was entitled Special Educational Needs. I'll come back to that title later. But also 1984 was the Collins Report in Victoria, okay, the integration report, which was really was a landmark report when you think about it. If you lift up the Warnock Report, take out the Collins Report and open to, I think it's probably about page 3 or 4, and you'll see there were 5 guiding principles. First principle, all children can learn and be taught. Second principle, all children have a right to be enrolled in their local school. All children have a right. This was in 1984, okay? The reason that, and we could augment your list of great events, and the reason I do that is I go back to all of those years with the call for more inclusive education, and we see what's been achieved in that period, and then we look at 2015, and as our Disability Rights Commissioner has been telling us, there are still incidences like this that we need to be vigilant about. And the incident in Canberra brought out cries of similar kinds of seclusion and restraint in schools in Queensland, and that precipitated an inquiry into education for students with disability in Queensland. So, I want to flip back, if I can manage that. To say, well, what is inclusive education? I start by saying that inclusive education is not the bolting together of regular and special education in the hope that that then will produce an inclusive schooling. I don't think that will work at all. Both institutions are inventions of a long, long time ago. They were invented to do specific tasks, and the world has changed around them. And I'm not demonising special education, nor some of the knowledge that came through special education. At one stage, special education was certainly a radical intervention to ensure that children who weren't receiving access to school were able to get an education. So the problem wasn't simply special education, the problem is the relationship between the two, and I'll spend more time talking about that. So I start to think in terms of special and regular education, of irregular education. What we're actually looking for is school reform writ large. How do we make new, different schools that are able to take all comers? Inclusive education is also an invitation to ask the big question, what kind of world do we want to live in? And at this particular point in time, and here I've got a slide which is probably very typical of scenes right around the world where people are displaced and they're passing their children one to the other across borders, over walls, over fences, in order to try to find a new life somewhere, to try to find the charity and goodwill of strangers. At this time, we need to think about that question of what kind of world we want to live in more than any other time, I think. The French social theorist Alain Touraine wrote a book called Can We Live Together? And in that, he said, if we want to answer that question, we need to look to education. What kind of education? An education in and for democracy. So that education, schooling, should be a democratic apprenticeship. So the goal isn't really inclusive education. The goal is a democratic education and inclusion, as Basil Bernstein, educational philosopher, said to us, or sociologist, so long ago. He didn't want to announce the need for a democratic education. He would simply take it as a given, and that the first prerequisite of that was inclusion, that all would be at the table. And he said, inclusion doesn't mean absorption, inclusion doesn't mean assimilation, inclusion means representation, access. So that's my take. And the subsidiary questions are, who's in, who's out, how come, and what are we going to do about it? And that really is the charter for inclusive education. And it's not simply about what others do, it's about ourselves. When we look at ourselves, what is it about what we think, do and say that needs to change as well? So, I'm almost back in order. We had the inquiry, the Shattuck inquiry in the ACT, and as our Commissioner said, there have been a plethora of inquiries throughout Australia over the past little while. And if we were to think about the report card from those, it gives us perhaps a way of reconfiguring issues about inclusion and exclusion. I was involved with Deloitte in the review of education in Queensland. I just want to talk about 3 elements that is there on the web in the report, if people are able to access that. And the first one is, first kind of data that we collected was around the question of the legal obligation, the right that people have to an education. And one of the things that we found repeatedly were incidences of parents having said to them by a principal, by a guidance officer, by a school administrator, that their child would be better off at the school down the road. They ought not to come to this school. As Bruce Uditsky in Canada would say, you just broke a parent's heart. You just broke a parent's heart. But you also broke the law. You also broke the law. Well, thank you very much. I should go now. But that's happening. And we heard parents saying, we're really happy with the school that our child is at. This is the 4th school that they've come to since they started. They're in grade 2 now. And so on. Now, this was not simply the commentary of parents. People from the Principals Association were also saying, as school principals, we are distraught that our colleagues are doing this. This is unacceptable. Let me move on quickly. I'm really pushing. The other issue is, one of the big questions that we put to the ministry was that you're trying to find inclusive education through a special education lens, that you use languages of special education to try to create inclusion. The notion of special educational needs, and I'll go to this later, is a collective fiction. It's an administrative category, nothing more, nothing less. But people believe in it. So they talk about the special needs child. How reductive is that? They talk about the high functioning child. All of this ableist language. So we found that quite problematic, and that the initiative for inclusion was very often taken by the special education fraternity. And our message was, no, inclusive education is everybody's business, but it's not business as usual. And the last point is very often we were presented with special segregation. I'll say segregation as being a safe alternative. So, and we can understand this as parents. Parents would say, we chose the special school because our child would be safe there and they would get the support and attention that they required. Very understandable. But it's not a choice. If the local school isn't doing that, you have no choice. It begs the question, sorry, I forgot myself for a moment. It begs the question of why isn't the local school safe? Why aren't we mobilising resources more flexibly into inclusion? Exclusion is a very costly business. Okay. Now here's where I'm going to try and earn my money as a sociologist. The review of the disability Standards for Education was an interesting document. They found a number of themes, 7 themes, where there were discussion of issues relating to those. The one I've highlighted for you is the contemporary education context. And I want to try to say that in our advocacy, in our thinking as education leaders about what kind of work we need to do, we need to think about the context. And your first stop, when you've finished reading Warnock and Collins, is you'll pick up Zygmunt Bauman's book, Wasted Lives. And I really hope you do, because it's lovely. Sadly, Zygmunt died earlier this year, and it's a great loss. So Bauman says that the more governments, the more public institutions talk about inclusion, there's another reality lurking in the shadows, that the more shrill becomes the talk of the discourse around inclusion, the more mixophobic we have become. He's saying that economies have created collateral casualties. There's an increase. People live under the spectre of uselessness. Redundancy is commonplace. Economies produce these collateral casualties. And that rather than being inclusive, we're in competition with our neighbour, we are mixophobic. Here's Zygmunt's language. I had a cunning plan before we started. I was going to read this very long quote to you in the mirror at the back of the room. But the mirror's lower than the screen. So if I just seamlessly go to the side, no, that's not going to work. Okay, the production of human waste has all the markings of an impersonal, purely technical issue. The principal actors in the drama are the terms of trade, and you'll see what he's saying. Means of production, the currency crisis, all of these impersonal actors. But he says these are the decisions made by and impacting real people with names and addresses. Then I went to something even more impossible to read to you. This is the story of Maggie. Maggie is in a retirement home, and you can see that it's in England. It wouldn't possibly happen here. The council, Maggie sadly dies. The retirement home has to dispose of her remains. The head of the retirement home thinks, well, hold on, that's a cost incurred by our business. And he goes to the local, and he wants to recover it. So he goes to the head of the local authority and says, well, according to the Environmental Protection Act, this is the waste material produced by our business, and it's likely to be harmful to the environment. Therefore, according to the Act, we need to dispose of this waste material. Now, see what's happened. We started off with Maggie, somebody's mum, somebody's grandmother, somebody's sister, perhaps wife, partner, lover. She was perhaps a musician, she may have been a teacher, she may have been a juggler, I don't know. But see how she goes through this technical sieve to become waste, just as Bauman is saying. Now, could that happen in education? In places elsewhere, again, wouldn't possibly happen here, you have league tables, high stakes tests, results published, schools competing one against the other. In that environment, students are seen as the bearers of results. Schools then start to become a little concerned about their position on the table, again, in places elsewhere, and they start to become a little more selective, a little more choosy, a little more risk averse about the students that they want. Under these conditions, notwithstanding all of the school prospectuses, just like the minister's introduction, talking about our job is to build good global citizens to take their place in a democratic society, all of that, the real ethos, the main game, is about competitive individualism. One competing against the other. Now, under those conditions, I'll save you from Bourdieu for now. How do we manage this situation so that schools can elevate their position, or some schools? Others accept their charter, which is all means all. You are our children. We educate you all. Some may be seeking ways to manage these kinds of issues. I'm going to suggest in a flight of fancy that perhaps special education is equal to that task. That, as Michael Leunig shows us in his cartoon, The Awful Party, we go through a process through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders of sorting out who belongs where. Here's a picture of me at a party I threw recently. I sorted my guests. They had their table places into the too ugly, the too old, the too boring, the too uninteresting, and so it goes. And what a very lonely life I lead. As Lani Florian told us at a similar gathering a little over a week ago, just like Maggie, aren't our identities far more complex than that? Aren't they so much richer? As educators, haven't we got so much more to draw upon? If we start to think of all of those dimensions of what makes us human, what makes us capable and competent. So there are other ways to read it. I'm fascinated by the work of Russell Barkley recently. Barkley you may know of as being very influential in research around attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. I don't know why I didn't say that just to start with instead of spelling it out. What's interesting about that particular diagnosis is, and I don't want to be clinical about this at all, is the disproportionalities we find. So that why do we find greater incidences in certain places than elsewhere? Does that tell us more about diagnosis or the child or both? I'm not sure. I think there are questions to be asked around that. But what's really interesting is Barkley is now researching in the area of what he calls sluggish cognitive tempo disorder. Sluggish cognitive tempo disorder. And if there's any one of you not suffering from that right now, I am. So my question about all of this is, where does this kind of drive to calibrate and categorise and assign populations end? The Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing has a statistic out recently where they talk about 1 in 4 students will suffer from a mental illness in the course of their school academic life. Now, from my own family experiences, I am not for one moment trying to suggest that it is not important to be far more vigilant, far more aware about mental illness. But 1 in 4, there's a statistical term, and Canadians are very polite people, and you'll forgive me here, I'm going to use the vernacular of the statistician, and that is 1 in 4 is a bloody big number. It's a big number. So my question then becomes, I can't help Lunik, where for those who can't see what's on this, read what's on the screen, that's my wife looking across at me and saying, Roger, I've just found out that your wonderful eccentricity is now a disorder. So what worries me about these kinds of trends and the further calibration of identities of defectiveness is whether or not these diagnoses become a proxy for problems in schooling. And one of the very first remarks from our Emcee was about the interaction between the individual and their environment. So, where does this all wind up? Oh, I had no idea how I was going to work this into it, so we'll move right along. Where does it all leave us? Recently, I've been working on a project to rewrite the teacher education curriculum for teachers in Ethiopia. So it involved producing materials so that the teachers would be able to teach students with disabilities in the regular classroom in Ethiopia. I'm not sure how to interpret a claim. I have children. I'm used to the opposite. So, a very funny story. I like to think of myself as a musician. I'm not. I'm a drummer. I said to my father as a kid, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a drummer. And he said, you can't do both, son. But playing in a band, I invited my son, who is a musician, if he wanted to come and listen to us. And he said, curled his lip up, and he said, yeah. What time do you go on? And I said, I think we go on at 8:30, 9. And he looked at me and he said, only the Wiggles and the Seekers go on before 11. So we're working on this project. Create the materials for the teacher educators to use with the next generation of teachers. And the question was, what do they need to be able to know, think, and be able to do in order to produce teachers able to teach students with disability in Ethiopian classrooms? Produce the materials, and a lot of it was about pedagogy, a lot of it was about universal design, and a lot of it was about the recognition of ableism and thinking about disability from a disability rights perspective and from the voices of people with disabilities themselves. The next part of it was the training programs. Very, very humbling, very humbling. Ethiopia is in the throes of a drought much worse than when Bob Geldof got upset in 1984. But Ethiopia, I think, do a fact check on me, I think it's either the second largest recipient of, or third largest recipient, I'll say, of refugees in the African continent, or the Somalis, Sudanese, and so on. So, very interesting context. Such, classrooms of 90 children. You can see the floors are bare. I had photos where they have their technology spread before you, blackboards, chalk, not many books, and so it goes. What really struck me was that in the absence of resources, people become quite resourceful. And I thought back to, in my desperation to escape my embarrassment about my privilege, I kind of transport myself in my head back to Australia, and I'm thinking, gee, in various reviews I've done, when I go to rural schools, I find similar things happen. Not always, but oftentimes. They start from a point of saying, these are our children. Boy, there are some challenges in educating all of our children. How are we going to do it? And then they set about the task. They set about the task because they can't defer and refer as their colleagues in urban settlements can. And that I found really useful. And I think of advocacy organisations, of parent networks, collaborating with ministries of education, with their local school, and that's where I find the hope. I'm not as optimistic about large school systems at the moment as I am about ground-up change from the local school, where parents working with teachers lead that change. One of the schools I went to, you can see this is a special school. And for those who can't see it, it's just a room, and what you see is a series of partitions made of cardboard. And behind each of those little cubicles of cardboard are groups of students. And this was one of the most wonderful experiences I've had in a long career. The special school principal said to me, Roger, we're very happy with our school. We have good teachers. We started off as a school that had a lot of children who were deaf or hard of hearing, and we got training for our teachers, and we think we're doing a very good job there. And then we started getting children with intellectual disabilities, and they use different language, and we think we're doing very well there. But we have this new problem, or enduring problem. And that problem is that when the parent comes and they drop off their child with a disability at the school, they're not able to then jump in their four-wheel drive and drive off to another school to drop the brothers and sisters. So we've got their brothers and sisters who don't have disabilities. And our teachers are really struggling to know how to teach a normal child. And it was wonderful. I thought I was in the French theatre of the absurd, finally. How do I teach a normal child? What a wonderful question. So, what I'm talking about is not the fortification of special and regular education, but a new educational imaginary, a new educational imagination. What do schools in the 21st century need to look like? What do teachers need to be able to know, think and be able to do? How will they enlist parents in order to teach all children, as is our legal responsibility and promise? So I'm arguing for school reform rather than the merging of special with regular, rather than the creation of the inclusion program at the back of the school in a separate room. It's a very different entity that we're talking about. How do you build partnerships between a number of professionals in the room? And school reform, as I told a group of people a week or so ago, got really serious. 10 minutes. Let me go back. Did I tell you? No. School reform has just got really serious for me. These are my brand new grandchildren. Well, they're 1 month, 3 weeks, and 3 days old. Felix Rocky and Lila Ruby. And I think we're running out of time because it's their education. And each one of you, in this assemblage today, or assembly today, each one of you are thinking of your own children. So when we're looking for indicators, I want to listen to what Bauman's saying, and I want us to move into the realm of the heart and the head to think about education and what a good education looks like. Thank you.
Roger. You may have heard what sounded like an aircraft taking off just a few seconds ago, which was the air conditioning kicking in. We were a little concerned about that we might be creating a space of sluggish cognition if we kept it as warm as it was. So that will kick in during morning tea break. Two more items for housekeeping. One more item for housekeeping. If you wish to log on to the Wi-Fi here, you can choose to go to West Inn Conference, and the password for that, let me just have a look here, pretty easy to remember, Westin, W-E-S-T-I-N, all capitals, and I'm not sure if it lets more than 50 on at a time, but Rumble, if you need to go and find someone who hasn't secured their own personal hotspots, see how you go. But I think we can get up to 50 on there, if not more, and just log in and use that Wi-Fi. We're now going to move out for morning tea and have a little bit of a break. You'll hear the bells and the gongs when you need to be moving back in, and we'll be straight back into it after the break. Thank you. We're going to get this session started. And not only will we enjoy a showcase of international systemic change to embrace inclusive education, but delve into what can happen at a local level when change is rooted in respect, acceptance, inclusion and belonging. You may have heard the one about the young principal who transformed a notorious, rough as guts high school to pillar of community. If you live in or around Sydney's inner southwest, well, the story is almost folklore. Elected to New South Wales State Parliament in 2015, Adhd is the member for Lakemba and Shadow Minister for Education. Adhd was also that 33-year-old principal at Punchbowl High whose passion to make a difference really did. Please welcome Adhd.